I wouldn't have had you if I had been aware of your illness. You have no place in our family." My world fell apart when my mother spoke those words. "Come on." With his head poking out the car window, my father said, "From now on, a new life begins for the three of us." He made his statement directly in front of my grandparents' deserted home. I was left behind as my parents drove off, laughing. I watched their automobile go away, transfixed in place. I was just 11 years old. I'm Rachel, and I will soon turn 26. Henry is my twin brother. We used to live with our parents, but due to the events of that time, we have been apart for more than 11 years. My mother worked part-time and took care of the house while my father had a regular job. Like any other family, ours was an average one. But when we began primary school, everything was different. My brother's abilities were immediately apparent when school started. He was supposed to pass every test with a flawless score. "You're fantastic, Henry. One more flawless score." My mother used to smile and say, "You're intelligent, and you'll be a great person someday." My dad used to chuckle and remark, "That's right. He can be an athlete, a doctor, or a scholar. He won't ever have to worry about money, at least." I had trouble at school in the interim. The sound of chairs shifting and pens clicking distracted me and made it difficult for me to concentrate. I was often reprimanded by teachers for not paying attention. My brother became the center of my parents' attention as the years went by. His favorites were always meals. He was provided whatever he desired and was able to take enjoyable vacations. However, things were totally different for me. I was frequently disregarded. Perhaps things might have turned out differently if I had told my instructors or other people how my parents treated me. I was unable to speak, though. I had trouble talking and expressing how I felt. My thoughts were disorganized, and I struggled to articulate them clearly. I can express myself a little more clearly now that I'm an adult, yet occasionally people still misinterpret me. Sometimes, even when I believe I'm responding appropriately, I fail to grasp the other person's meaning and wind up saying something that doesn't make sense. I was once informed by my mother that I had a little developmental issue from birth. I've become better at doing things on my own over the years, but I still have a lot of obstacles to overcome. I was hard for adults to handle when I was a kid. However, that did not justify my parents' disregard for me. Despite their disdain, I continued to develop and learn. My parents thought I was a stupid kid. They treated me like I had no value and constantly made comparisons to my gifted brother. They had all the power back then, but now that I'm an adult, I could confront them. I didn't protest or fight. I simply grinned and took it all in. When we were little, my brother and I had a tight relationship, but he changed as he grew older. He began to act as though I was a burden and gave up on attempting to understand me. One day he warned me, "Don't talk to me at school. We don't look alike, which is a good thing. I don't want our sibling status to be known. Just keep silent. You're a moron." His kind remarks quickly vanished, and he began to treat me as though I were repulsive. After a while, he stopped paying attention to me. My parents never cared about how he treated me. They had already stopped paying attention to me, and I became invisible in my own home. On special days like birthdays and Christmas, my parents took my brother out to eat. I wasn't invited. There were no cakes, no gifts, no celebrations for me. They would buy me a cheap, discounted meal from the supermarket and leave me home alone. Even on New Year's, it was the same. "Stay in your room. I can't focus with you around," my father told me. So while my family celebrated in the living room, I sat in my room, eating snacks by myself, listening to their laughter. "You don't need study materials, right? You can't do anything anyway," my parents said. Without a second thought, they bought my brother a desk and all the study supplies he needed, but they gave me nothing. I lost all motivation to study, and my grades got worse and worse. I felt like I didn't belong at school or at home. But there were 3 people I trusted, my grandparents. They lived far away, over 3 hours by car, so we couldn't visit them often. Still, I was allowed to go with my family twice a year, once in the summer and once at the end of the year. The only rule was that I had to stay quiet the whole time. My grandparents lived in the countryside, surrounded by nature. My parents and brother thought it was boring, but to me it was a magical place. I loved the beautiful colors of the trees, the sky, and the fields. While my brother stayed busy studying, I spent my time drawing. I used my colored pencils to sketch landscapes on the back of old flyers. My parents and brother looked at me with disgust, but my grandparents didn't. Instead, they hung my drawings on their fridge and said, "What a beautiful sunset you drew." That moment filled me with happiness, not just because they put up my drawing, but because they understood what I wanted to say without me having to speak. My grandparents didn't treat me any better than my brother, but they loved both of us equally. That was rare in my life. The 2 visits each year were the only times I felt supported. Then, when we were 11 years old, something unexpected happened. It was a cold April day, just as spring break had started, when my parents suddenly made an announcement. "We've sold our apartment." I was confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. My brother laughed. "You're so dumb. The house is sold. We're moving to a new place and starting a new life." I felt overwhelmed. If our home was sold, where would we live? What about school? When were we moving? Why so suddenly? Before I could ask more questions, my father snapped at me. "Shut up. You always talk about useless things. How could you not notice? We've been getting ready for a long time. Just pack your stuff." I looked around in shock. The living room was already packed up. I hadn't noticed before because I spent most of my time in my room. Things had been disappearing little by little, but I never realized what was happening. Panicking, I held back my tears and started packing. I could only take a few toys and just enough clothes to get by. Since it was spring break, most of what I had left were my school supplies. I packed them all into boxes as fast as I could. "I'm ready. Everything is packed, and I have my school bag too," I said, hoping for some kind of response. But my father just waved me off. "We don't need your report. Just get in the car." "Okay, I understand," I said quietly. My father roughly tossed my cardboard box into the trunk, and I got into the car, holding my school bag. But something felt off. Henry, who always sat next to me, wasn't there. "Where's Henry?" "He's not here. Where is he? It can't be just the 3 of us moving, right? Are we missing some bags?" "Be quiet in the car," my mother snapped at me. I quickly shut my mouth. "You're hard to understand," my father said. "We gave your brother some pocket money and let him go out to play. Now, be quiet." I fell silent and stared blankly at the blossoming trees outside the car window. But then a small hope lit up in my heart. Maybe, just like they always took my brother out for fun, this time they were taking me somewhere special. Maybe this move was a surprise for me. Without realizing it, I smiled. My parents were quietly talking about something, but I was too excited to care about their conversation. I never imagined that this happiness would turn into something. At some point, I fell asleep. Suddenly, my mother's loud voice jolted me awake. "Wake up, take your school bag and get out of the car." Still half asleep, I stepped out of the car, confused about where we were. But then I saw the familiar sight in front of me, my grandparents' house. "Yay, Grandma, Grandpa," I said happily as I rushed to the door. But when I tried to open it, I froze. The door was locked. "Mom, I can't get in." "Oh, is that so? Well, today's a weekday, so they're probably still at work," she said casually. "But I just called them, so they'll be back soon. See you." Before I could process what she meant, my father dropped my bags in front of the door and got back into the car. Panic filled me. I quickly grabbed my mother's hand. "Wait, where are you going?" "Mom, Dad, wait. We're going back. "We can't leave your brother alone, can we?" my mother said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. What? My heart pounded. She pulled her hand away from mine and said, "Your brother got into a famous private elementary school that guarantees a good future. He's transferring next term. We sold the apartment to help pay for his tuition, and we're moving to a new house for him." I stared at her, stunned. "But what about me?" "You being around distracts him, and you cost extra money for food. With a new school year starting, this is a perfect chance for you to stay here." Wait, am I transferring to a different school? My voice shook with confusion. My mother's expression darkened. "This is exactly what annoys me," she snapped. I didn't know what to say. "You've been a burden to me since you were little," my mother said coldly. "Your grades are bad, and you don't even look good. You can't hold a proper conversation. Your brother is such a good child, but you always cause problems." I felt my heart pound. Did I do something wrong? If I did, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. "I don't need fake apologies," she snapped. "If I had known about your condition, I wouldn't have had you. You don't belong in our family." Her words made my whole world go dark. "Let's go. From now on, a new life begins for the three of us," my father said loudly, sticking his head out of the car window. I had to stop them somehow. "Don't go. Don't leave me here. Dad, Mom, am I really such a bad child?" Thoughts spun in my head, but when I tried to speak, I couldn't get the words out. My mouth moved, but nothing came. My mother only glanced at me before getting into the car. "Sorry for the wait," she said to my father. "Since we're here, let's buy that famous cake from around here and eat it with Henry." I stood there, frozen, watching as my parents drove away. "Rachel, are you okay? Rachel, say something." Through my teary eyes, I saw my grandparents looking at me with worry. By then it was already dark. While waiting for them, I must have fallen asleep outside without realizing it. "Your hands are freezing, and your face is so pale," my grandfather said as he wrapped me in his jacket. Then he carried me on his back and brought me inside to a warm room. My grandparents moved quickly, speaking in angry voices. "How long was Rachel left outside?" my grandmother said in disbelief. They had found out only by accident. My grandfather happened to check his phone at work and saw a message from my parents. "We left Rachel in front of the house. Please take care of her." That was it. No warning, no explanation. My parents didn't even bother to call in advance. They just sent that one message and disappeared. At that moment, I realized how little I meant to them. As I sipped the hot milk my grandmother gave me, the warmth spread through my body. I felt safe for the first time. But the moment I relaxed, my tears started falling. My grandmother gently stroked my back and let me cry. Meanwhile, my grandfather suddenly stood up and grabbed the phone. He called my father, his voice firm and angry. The conversation quickly turned into a shouting match, and finally he slammed the phone down. "I talked to your dad, but we couldn't have a proper conversation," my grandfather said. "Can you tell me what happened?" Through my tears, I tried to explain everything that had led up to this moment. My words were messy, more jumbled than usual, but my grandparents just listened quietly. "They said I don't belong in the family because I have a developmental disorder," I sobbed. "That it would have been better if I was never born. Mom and Dad are starting a new life with Henry." As I choked out those words, my grandmother suddenly wrapped me in a tight hug. "What are you saying? You are a wonderful child," she said firmly. "No matter what anyone says, you are precious to us. I'm truly happy that you were born." But, people's worth isn't decided by how smart they are or how they look," she continued. "Your grandfather and I are just ordinary people. We didn't go to fancy schools, but we lived our lives doing what we were good at. You might struggle with studying, but you have a gift for feeling and expressing things deeply. That is a talent that belongs only to you." Talent. I whispered. "Yes," my grandfather said gently. "There's no one like you. Here, who will make you feel small anymore? You don't have to be afraid. I'm sorry we didn't see what was happening sooner," he added, stroking my head. "You've been trying your best all this time." Hearing those words, I couldn't hold back my emotions anymore. I burst into tears, and my grandparents held me until I had cried everything out. From that day on, I started living with them. They enrolled me in a small local elementary school where the teachers were patient and kind. One teacher, in particular, was the first person outside my grandparents who truly understood me. Because there weren't many students, the school had a special program that adjusted lessons to each student's needs. They considered my struggles and helped me learn in a way that worked for me. Thanks to that, my grades, which had always been bad before, started to improve. Even though I still found it hard to communicate, I learned to accept myself. Eventually, I made friends. My life became easier, both mentally and physically, and I finally discovered what I truly wanted to do. 16 years passed. During that time, I never heard from my parents or my brother. At some point, their addresses and phone numbers changed, and before I knew it, they had completely disappeared from my life. Their faces started fading from my memory. But then one day, everything changed. Bang, bang, bang. "Open the door. I know you're in there." The loud knocking shattered the peaceful morning silence. My grandparents were already awake. Still groggy, I got out of bed and walked toward the entrance. "For over a decade you abandoned your own daughter." My grandfather's angry voice rang out. "What do you want now?" I stepped outside and froze in shock. "Well, if it isn't Rachel, you've grown so much." The woman standing before me looked nothing like the mother I remembered. She used to be neat and polished, but now she looked worn out and tired. The man beside her had a big belly, nothing like my father's once slim figure. They both smiled warmly and reached out their hands as if we were family. I stepped back, avoiding their touch, and glared at them. "If you're really my parents, why are you here?" "Don't talk like we're strangers," my mother said. "We came to talk." Talk. "Yes," my father said, nodding. "We've heard everything. It seems this workshop is doing really well now. Your grandfather is getting old, and as both a manager and a craftsman, he can't keep up like he used to. That's why we've come back." My mother added with a smile, "I thought I'd take over the business, and we heard that our lovely daughter is set to inherit it. That should be ours to receive." My grandfather let out a sharp snort at their words. "Oh, so you're back to take whatever's left, huh? And you even think you can run the workshop?" He shook his head in disbelief. How bold. An amateur who knows nothing about glasswork thinks he can take over. "We've already chosen the next owner." "What?" My mother and father exchanged glances. "It's Rachel," my grandfather said firmly. "She's a genius." "Ridiculous," my father spat. "This child, she can't do anything." Before he could continue, my grandmother suddenly threw a newspaper at his face. "What are you doing?" he asked angrily. "Look inside, you fool," she snapped. "Read it." Confused, my father flipped through the newspaper. His eyes widened as he looked at me, then back at the article, then at me again. "A young glass artisan from a small workshop goes global." It was a feature from a recent interview. By the time I was in middle school, I had fallen in love with my grandfather's work. I started helping in the workshop, first as an assistant, but as I became more involved, I quickly became an apprentice. My grandfather recognized my skills, and I developed a deep passion for capturing nature's beauty in glass. A few years ago, I finally created a piece I had always. I dreamed of making it big. When I started selling my work, it became popular on social media. Soon, people began recognizing my talent, and I became known as a skilled glass artisan. Now I receive orders from restaurants and shops worldwide. The workshop has grown. We've hired more artisans, and we even sell online." My father suddenly burst into laughter. "You really are our daughter," he said, exaggerating his praise. "Not like that useless Tim, son of ours." My mother eagerly nodded in agreement. "Useless. Tim," I repeated, shocked by their words. They spoke about my brother as if he was nothing, completely different from the way they used to praise him. I asked about Henry. My mother glared at me sharply. "Just listen," she snapped. Then, with excitement in her voice, she started talking. According to her, my brother had graduated from university and gotten a job at a top company. At first, everything was going well, but after years of being praised as a genius, he became arrogant and fragile. When he faced challenges in the real world, he couldn't handle them. He quit his job less than a year after starting. "Can you believe it? Just a little scolding and he gave up," she scoffed. Now, Henry barely left his room. He only came out to use the bathroom or take a shower. "We quit our jobs because Henry started working," my father added. Then, looking at my grandfather, he said, "Dad, putting the inheritance aside, you have money, right? Can't you take care of us, at least me and your daughter?" My grandfather looked at him in shock. "Do you two only think about yourselves?" he asked. "He's still young. He'll figure something out," my father argued. "But we can't find new jobs at our age. If you let us stay here, we'll be fine. Come on, Dad, just listen to your loving son's request." My grandfather let out a deep sigh and went back inside. I stood there, speechless. Then my mother turned to me, staring. "You should live with your mom and dad too, right?" she asked. Then she laughed. "Oh, I forgot. You don't even understand what we're talking about. Just nod and agree." Her eyes were bloodshot. My father nodded along as if everything she said made sense. I took a deep breath and answered, "Why should I live with strangers?" "What?" My mother's smile disappeared. "We're your real parents. We raised you," my father shouted. "When I lived with you, I never felt like I was cared for. I barely existed," I said firmly. "It was my grandparents and my teachers who actually raised me." They froze, shocked by my words. "You may be my parents by law," I continued, "but I have no memory of you as parents. I can't live with strangers." I looked at them, truly seeing them as strangers. If I was wrong, my grandparents would correct me. But they didn't say a word. My grandfather simply smiled. My father turned to him. "Don't you think that's a terrible thing to say? Dad, say something." My grandfather shrugged. "If you want me to say something, fine. It's strange that you claim to have raised Rachel when you abandoned her at 10. "No, not about me. Say something to her." "Rachel," my grandfather said, turning to me, "say something to your father." I looked at my father. "Something," I said blankly. "No, that's not what I meant," he shouted, flustered. "You told me to say something," I replied, "so I did." My father's face turned red with frustration. My grandfather let out a chuckle before laughing loudly. "Don't abandon us, Dad, please," my father begged. My grandfather waved him off. "Enough already," he said in a deep, firm voice. "Why are you acting so spoiled now?" At his sharp tone, both my parents froze. My grandmother quickly went to the kitchen. She returned holding a large bag in her hand. "Perfect. Now get out. You bring bad luck," she said, then suddenly threw a handful of salt at my mother's face. "Ouch! What is this?" my mother shrieked. "Salt," my grandmother said calmly, holding up the bag. "Parents who abandon their own child bring nothing but bad luck." Then she grabbed another handful and threw it at my father. "Go back already," she shouted. "I'll keep throwing salt until you leave." My grandfather stood beside her, holding a fresh bag of salt. "Leave," he roared as he threw a handful at them with force. The salt hit my parents straight in the face. "Stop it, Dad. Mom, please," my parents cried, but my grandparents didn't stop. They stood firm, shouting, go back, never come back. My parents, now desperate, clung to my hands. Are you really going to abandon your own parents? They pleaded. We're drowning in debt. We can't survive like this. Isn't family supposed to help each other? I looked at them coldly. My family is only my grandparents. I yanked my hands free from their grip. My parents collapsed to the ground in despair. I took the bag of salt from my grandmother and stepped forward. This is goodbye forever, I said. Then I emptied the entire bag of salt over them. That was the final moment. My parents, defeated, scrambled to their feet and ran away as if they were fleeing for their lives. Time passed. One day my brother showed up at the workshop. After my parents ran away, the debt collectors chasing them had left Henry behind. They fled in the middle of the night, abandoning him. Soon, the debt collectors found their house, evicted my brother, and left him completely lost. He was taken in by the police. Since we were his only living relatives, the authorities contacted my grandparents. You don't work, you don't eat, my grandfather said firmly. If you're willing to work hard and help out in the workshop, we'll give you a place to live and food to eat. What do you say? My brother agreed right away. At first, he struggled with the workshop tasks. His skills were rough, and my grandfather and the other workers often scolded him. But when he started handling online sales and accounting, his talent shone through. Soon, he became an important part of the workshop. Now that he's grown, my brother feels ashamed of how he treated me in the past. He acknowledges my skills and even supports me. It's still too soon to say we've completely made up, but it feels both nice and a little awkward to have him treating me kindly again. For the first time in my life, I feel a happiness I never had as a child.